This video will take a brief look at concepts related to animal reproduction. However, we will focus primarily on human reproduction. Let's just begin by making some general comments, and that is when you think about reproduction, you probably think of sexual reproduction in animals. And fair enough, that's quite common among animals, but I do want to point out that many animals are quite good at asexual reproduction as well. So for example, we can have fission, illustrated by the sea anemone in the upper right here. This is essentially where an organism can split apart into two separate organisms, each of which can then grow and develop entirely on its own. Budding, on the other hand, is illustrated by the hydra, this small aquatic organism illustrated in the lower left, which essentially has patches of cells located on its body that can divide by mitosis and produce a new individual that eventually will separate from the original organism and grow entirely on its own. Parthenogenesis, on the other hand, is illustrated by these lizards. Although it looks like they're mating, they're both female. So parthenogenesis occurs when egg cells develop into fully functional embryos without fertilization ever taking place. So again, these are all forms of asexual reproduction, just mechanisms by which organisms can produce genetically identical clones of themselves. But let's now focus our attention on some basic aspects related to human reproduction. And we'll begin by just illustrating a few concepts related to production of sperm in men. When we think about sperm production, a few things to keep in mind. First of all, in men, production of sperm, in other words, the process of meiosis resulting in the formation of sperm, it begins at puberty. Also, the diploid cells that eventually divide by meiosis to produce sperm that represent the precursors to sperm cells, they are continuously renewed after puberty begins in a male. Sperm cells are small. It's easy for men to produce lots and lots of sperm. Just to give you an idea, a single ejaculation can have as many as 300 million sperm cells. Also keep in mind that after intercourse, sperm can live for up to 5 days. And so conception can actually occur within 5 days after intercourse taking place. Let's now take a brief look at the mechanisms that are involved in regulating spermatogenesis in men. So here we're looking at a figure illustrating hormonal control of spermatogenesis. There are a variety of regions and hormones involved in this regulation process. Let's just mention initially that we have portions of our brain, so namely the hypothalamus and our pituitary, that produce hormones that regulate spermatogenesis. Toward the bottom of this figure, we see a single testicle. So lots of things happening within a testicle, but ultimately we're looking at the production of sperm cells or spermatogenesis. So what's going on here? Well, essentially, once a person reaches puberty, once a man reaches puberty, his hypothalamus produces this hormone here, GnRH, short for gonadotropin-releasing hormone. The GnRH makes its way to the pituitary gland, and in response to the GnRH, the pituitary releases these two hormones, namely follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, as well as luteinizing hormone, or LH. So these hormones make their way into the bloodstream, interact with cells in the testes, and ultimately FSH and LH tend to increase or trigger spermatogenesis. I would mention that LH triggers spermatogenesis by virtue of producing testosterone, which is needed at moderate levels for the production of sperm cells. I would also mention that testosterone also has an impact on parts of the brain. And so essentially what testosterone does is once it reaches high enough levels, testosterone tends to inhibit the hypothalamus, hence the red area with a minus here. It also inhibits the pituitary. And so in essence, when testosterone levels get high enough, hypothalamus is inhibited, therefore GnRH levels decrease. Pituitary is inhibited, therefore FSH and LH levels decrease. Ultimately what that does is tends to decrease or inhibit spermatogenesis. So the point is, this is another example of a negative feedback loop. And so spermatogenesis is controlled and maintained at moderate levels once a person reaches puberty. So now a few comments about female reproductive anatomy. Just a few of the major structures we'll identify. First of all, the ovaries. Ovaries, of course, are the organs where egg cells develop. Roughly once each month, an egg cell is released during ovulation. That egg makes its way into the oviduct or the fallopian tube, and if this egg cell happens to be fertilized, if conception takes place, it tends to occur in the oviduct. Mitosis occurs as the embryo divides into a small ball of cells that eventually implants on the inner lining of the uterus, also referred to as the endometrium. So just a few comments about the production of eggs that occur within ovaries. I just want to point out that all of the egg cell precursors, in other words, all the cells that are destined to develop into eggs, they are present at birth in females. And so essentially females carry around their immature egg cells with them their entire lives. Once a woman reaches puberty, she starts to ovulate roughly once every month or every 28 days or so. And so just a few concepts about ovulation. So again, ovulation refers to the release of an egg cell roughly once every 28 days or so. And if we talk about a follicle, what we're talking about is basically an egg cell illustrated by this blue cell in this image here. So a follicle is an egg cell plus the surrounding tissue around an egg cell. So follicles essentially grow and develop each month, and when ovulation occurs, roughly midway through the 28-day cycle, that of course refers to the release of an egg cell, which again is picked up by the oviduct. Once that egg is released, it only survives for about 24 hours. So if you think about that, we said earlier that sperm can live for about 5 days after intercourse. An egg can live for about 24 hours after ovulation. So in other words, in order for a woman to conceive or become pregnant, intercourse has to occur roughly either 5 days before or within 1 day after ovulation. Any time before that, and the sperm simply are no longer alive. Any time after that, and by that point, the egg cell would no longer be alive. So again, there's just a small window each month that conception can actually take place. Let's now explore some of the hormonal regulation involved in the monthly menstrual cycle of women. So we're looking at a few figures. We've seen this one on the left before. This one on the right illustrates a few aspects of the female reproductive cycle. We're looking at a typical 28-day cycle associated with those 28 days. Bottom panel is looking at the level at which the endometrium, or the inner lining of the uterus, is developed. This middle panel is looking at some hormones, namely FSH and LH. These, of course, are produced from the pituitary, just like we mentioned within men. So we're looking at pituitary hormones in the middle panel. The top panel is looking at the level of estradiol, which is an estrogen, as well as progesterone. So these are hormones produced from ovaries. So this panel examines some of the interactions between different parts of a woman's body, namely her ovaries, her brain, and her uterus, and some of the interplay between those hormones and how they regulate what's taking place in the uterus itself. Notice we can identify two phases, namely follicular phase and luteal phase. Follicular phase, that's the first 14 days, during which a follicle is growing within an ovary. Ovulation occurs about day 14. After that, notice the follicle is retained in the ovary and develops into this very distinct yellow corpus luteum, which, as we'll see, plays an important role during this whole process. So, two phases would be the follicular phase, the first 14 days, and then the luteal phase, the next 14 days, after which the corpus luteum is present in the ovary. Let's now explore some of the interactions taking place among the hormones as they are involved in maintaining the reproductive cycle. So initially, we have a follicle that grows for a while, and it produces estradiol. So here we see the estradiol levels increasing. As the estradiol levels increase, that promotes growth of the endometrium. So notice around day 8 or so, we see the endometrium starting to grow and develop in preparation for a potential pregnancy. Notice that the estradiol levels reach quite high levels, roughly around day 10 or so, which then causes this surge in FSH and LSH that FSH and LH that we see around day 14. It's that surge in LH, that luteinizing hormone, that's what triggers ovulation. So that's what triggers a follicle to rupture and release an egg cell. After ovulation occurs, the follicle again remains behind in the ovary and develops into this yellow corpus luteum. Now the corpus luteum produces progesterone as well as some estradiol. So that's illustrated here. Notice around day 21 we have pretty high levels of progesterone and fairly high levels of estradiol as well. So what happens? These high levels of progesterone especially, and estradiol as well, they tend to inhibit the pituitary. As a result, we see fairly low levels of FSH and LH. Now, I just want to point out here that what we see happening here around day 21, this also reflects the mechanism by which many birth control pills work. So many birth control pills contain estrogens and progesterones at levels that maintain fairly low levels of FSH and LH, thereby preventing the surge that we see here. And so if you never get the surge in these hormones, especially the LH, ovulation tends not to take place. So birth control pills function by preventing or inhibiting ovulation. The estrogen, or the estradiol, and the progesterone produced from the corpus luteum, that tends to promote further growth of the endometrium. So by this point, again by day 21 or so, the endometrium is nice and thick, lots of blood there, again in preparation for a potential pregnancy. Assuming that conception does not take place, what happens? Well, the corpus luteum eventually degenerates, it breaks down. As a result, progesterone levels drop off because the corpus luteum is no longer there producing progesterone. As a result, the endometrium, or the inner lining of the uterus, is no longer maintained. So a few days later, it too breaks down and is shed during menstruation. So a woman experiences her period. So those are the events that occur on a normal basis, again assuming that pregnancy does not take place. But what if conception does occur? How do things change? One of the things that happens that causes a woman to think that perhaps she might be pregnant is that she might be late for her period. So instead of experiencing her menstrual cycle, it might be late. And so what happens during pregnancy? Well, the endometrium is maintained, which makes sense. You wouldn't want to lose or shed the endometrium if in fact there's an embryo implanted. So how is the endometrium maintained during pregnancy? Turns out this is also the basis for home pregnancy tests. The embryo itself produces a hormone which tends to maintain the corpus luteum. And it's the presence of this hormone that's tested for in pregnancy tests. So what is the hormone? Well, it's referred to as human chorionic gonadotropin, or simply HCG. So again, the embryo itself produces HCG. That causes the corpus luteum to be maintained. So the corpus luteum, instead of degenerating, it's retained and is kept healthy. If the corpus luteum is retained, progesterone levels, instead of dropping off, they are maintained at high levels. That then allows the endometrium to stay in place and again nourish the embryo as the pregnancy proceeds. Eventually, however, the corpus luteum stops doing its job and stops producing progesterone, but that's okay. By the second trimester, the placenta begins to produce its own progesterone, thereby allowing the pregnancy to proceed. So an understanding of how these hormones and various things work and interact with other, these, again, as I mentioned before, these are the basis behind various forms of birth control. So we've already mentioned the pill. Most birth control pills work by preventing ovulation. They essentially prevent that surge in LH that we tend to see around day 14 of the typical menstrual cycle. Other possibilities include the morning after pill, also referred to as Plan B. These also contain hormones similar to those found in birth control pills, but they function by one of two different mechanisms. They can prevent ovulation from occurring if ovulation has not occurred yet, or they can prevent conception from occurring, even though the egg cell might have been released at that point. So the morning after pill, again, that can be effective even several days after sexual intercourse. The final one we'll mention is RU486, also referred to as the abortion pill. This one functions even if conception has occurred, and even if an embryo has implanted in the endometrium. RU486 basically blocks the receptors for progesterone in the uterus. So even though the corpus luteum is there producing progesterone, the uterus never sees the effect of that progesterone, again because this chemical blocks those receptors. So as a result, the endometrium is shed, and so thereby terminating an early pregnancy. This, of course, is perhaps the most controversial of these birth control forms, because you are actually causing the loss of an embryo that has already implanted in the endometrium itself.